That's exactly why it took me so long to realize something was wrong. For years, I told myself I was doing the right thing. I believed I was being responsible, realistic, and patient. I thought that as long as things looked stable, everything was fine. I wasn't falling apart. I wasn't making reckless decisions, and I wasn't obviously unhappy. On the surface, my life made sense. But recently, I started feeling a quiet discomfort that I couldn't ignore anymore. It wasn't a breakdown or a crisis. It was subtler than that. It was the realization that I've been postponing my own life for years and calling it responsibility. Almost everything that matters to me gets delayed. Not because I don't care, but because there's always a reason to wait. Later when work slows down. Later when I'm less tired. Later when I have more money. Later when I feel more confident. Later when things are calmer. At some point, later stopped being a temporary delay and became a permanent mindset. At some point, later stopped being a temporary delay and became a permanent mindset. This habit doesn't look dangerous. In fact, it looks smart. Society rewards it. People praise you for being disciplined, focused, and reliable. You become the person who handles things, who doesn't complain, who keeps going no matter what. No one warns you that this habit has a cost. At first, postponing life feels like a reasonable trade. You believe you're sacrificing a little now for a better future later. You tell yourself it's just a phase, and that once things are stable, you'll finally focus on what matters to you. But phases stretch. Days turn into months. Months turn into years. And without noticing, you stop asking yourself what you actually want. You focus only on what you need to maintain. I still function. I still perform. I still meet expectations. But inside, something feels muted. My days started blending together. Time started moving faster. Weeks passed without leaving clear memories behind. I realized I couldn't clearly explain what I was working toward anymore. I could only explain what I was trying not to lose. That realization was uncomfortable because nothing was technically wrong. And yet, something felt deeply off. This habit survives because it feels safe. You're not quitting. You're not failing. You're not taking risks that could blow up your life. You're just waiting. Waiting until you're less busy. Waiting until you feel ready. Waiting until you have permission. Waiting until the perfect moment arrives. But here's what no one tells you. Waiting has a cost, and it compounds quietly. Every year you delay meaningful decisions, you become more attached to predictability. You build routines that keep you comfortable but confined. You invest so much energy into maintaining stability that change starts to feel threatening. Not because you're weak, but because you've trained yourself to avoid discomfort. At 35, I started noticing how often I choose what's familiar over what's meaningful. How often I avoid certain choices not because they're impossible, but because they would require energy, uncertainty, or emotional risk. That's when it hit me. This habit isn't neutral, it's directional, and the direction is quiet decline. Not a dramatic collapse. Not visible failure. Just a future that slowly narrows. Fewer options, less flexibility, less curiosity, less courage. The scariest part is how reasonable it all sounds. I'll do it when things slow down. I'll focus on myself later. This isn't the right time. Those sentences sound responsible, mature even, but when you repeat them long enough, they become beliefs. And those beliefs shape your identity. You become someone who waits. Waiting feels safer than choosing, until you realize that time is choosing for you. I started thinking about how many people I know who live this way. People who are busy, productive, and exhausted. People who talk about their dreams in vague terms, like something that exists in another lifetime. We don't talk about this habit because there's nothing obvious to point at. No single mistake. No clear villain. Just a pattern that quietly drains meaning from everyday life. This habit convinces you that survival is enough. That as long as you're functioning, you're fine. That fulfillment is optional. Something you can come back to later. But survival was never the goal. What worries me most isn't that I made bad choices. It's that I avoided choices altogether I stayed in motion without direction. I kept myself busy enough to avoid asking uncomfortable questions. Questions like, what am I actually building? Who am I becoming by default? And if nothing changed, would I choose this future consciously? At 35, I can still change course. That's what makes this realization painful and urgent at the same time. Because I can see how easy it would be to keep going like this. To blink and be 45, then 55. Still saying later. This habit doesn't take your life away all at once. It takes your sense of agency, slowly, politely, without resistance. You wake up one day and realize you've been living on autopilot and calling it responsibility. I'm not saying everyone should quit their job or make reckless changes. That's not the point. The point is awareness. Because once you see this habit for what it is, it's hard to unsee. Every time you delay something meaningful, you're not just postponing an action. You're reinforcing an identity, the identity of someone who waits. And waiting becomes comfortable enough to trap you. I noticed how often I distract myself instead of confronting discomfort, how easy it is to fill empty moments with noise instead of reflection, how rarely I sit with the feeling that something in my life needs to change. This habit thrives in distraction. It survives on busyness. As long as you're occupied, you don't have to think about direction. But direction doesn't appear on its own. It requires intention, and intention requires discomfort. That's what I avoided. At 35, I realized that being responsible had become an excuse to avoid uncertainty, that being realistic had become a way to shrink my expectations, that patience had become passivity. I told myself I was being smart, but really, I was being afraid of failing, afraid of being judged, afraid of disrupting the life I'd built, even if that life felt empty in certain ways. This habit trains you to settle quietly, not because you lack ambition, but because you don't want to risk what you already have. The problem is that what you already have might not be enough. I started noticing subtle signs, a lack of excitement, a sense of boredom that no amount of rest fixed, a feeling that I was watching my own life instead of participating in it. These aren't dramatic symptoms. They're easy to ignore. That's why so many people live with them for decades. We normalize exhaustion. We normalize dissatisfaction. We normalize drifting. And we tell ourselves it's just adulthood. But adulthood doesn't have to feel like this. I think about the version of myself from 10 years ago. How much more open I was. How much less calculated. How willing I was to try things without knowing the outcome. I didn't lose that because life became harder. I lost it because I stopped choosing. I let routines decide for me. I let obligations dictate my priorities. I let comfort slowly replace curiosity. This habit didn't arrive overnight. It built itself quietly, one reasonable decision at a time. That's why it's so hard to fight. It never announces itself as a problem. It disguises itself as common sense, but common sense without reflection can become a cage. At 35, I don't want to look back and realize I lived carefully instead of consciously. I don't want my life to be defined by what I avoided rather than what I pursued. This realization doesn't mean I have all the answers. I don't. It just means I can no longer pretend the habit is harmless. Postponing life isn't neutral. It shapes who you become. Every year you delay meaningful action, the cost increases. Not because opportunities disappear overnight, but because your willingness to act erodes. Comfort becomes heavier, change feels riskier, and the gap between who you are and who you could be starts to feel unbridgeable. That's what scares me. Not failure, not struggle, but quiet regret. Regret that doesn't come from doing something wrong, but from not doing anything at all. I see older versions of this habit everywhere. People who followed all the rules, did everything right, and still feel like something slipped away. They don't talk about it loudly. They mention it casually, in jokes, in sighs, in comments like, if I had more time, or back then, I should have. Those moments stay with me, because they're reminders of where this habit leads. I'm 35, and I don't want to become someone who lives entirely in hindsight. That doesn't mean reckless change. It means intentional movement. Small decisions made consciously instead of by default. It means questioning later before it becomes a permanent answer. It means accepting discomfort as part of growth instead of something to avoid at all costs. This habit is quiet. It's praised. It's everywhere. And that's why it's dangerous. If you feel that subtle discomfort, that sense that time is moving faster than your sense of direction, don't ignore it. That feeling isn't laziness. It isn't weakness. It isn't failure. It's awareness trying to get your attention. And the longer you postpone listening to it, the more expensive it becomes. I'm learning that now. Not too late, but late enough to understand what's at stake. I'm 35 years old, and I don't want my future to be shaped by a habit I never questioned. That's why I'm finally paying attention.